Welcome to the Church History Podcast. I'm your host, Lorelee Siemens. If you're new to the podcast, we cover church history chronologically. We started with the life of Christ and have traveled through time to the late 1800s. However, since it's December, we're covering the story of Christmas, and since we cover the church's story chronologically, we're covering the story of Christmas chronologically. But it's a pretty big story to cover in 1 month, so we're having a few extra episodes in between our regular Monday episodes. So far this month, we've covered the pre-Christian traditions, we've covered the early church, the start of December 25th as a day to remember Adam and Eve, sin entering into the world, and Jesus' power to save us. We've talked about the two oldest carols, O Come, Emmanuel, and the first Noel. Was it written by the French or the English? Who knows? We've also talked about Joy to the World, a Christmas carol that was never meant to be a Christmas carol, and the start of the Christmas tree celebration. Today, we're going to be talking about two carols. The first one is Handel's Messiah, my all-time favorite choir music that has become a Christmas tradition for many people, and also Hark, the Herald Angels Sing. These are two episodes I've done before, so I'm replaying them. I hope you enjoy. George was born in 1685. This was actually the same year the great composer Bach was born. They were a Protestant family, and at that time, all of the churches had organs and choirs. Now, at age 7, George and his father visited the Holy Trinity Church. George was in awe of the beauty of the church, and he asked if he could play the organ. The Duke agreed, and little George sat down to play. Now, everyone was expecting childlike noise. But instead, beautiful music filled the church hall. The Duke told his father he must give George a musical education. So George's father bought an organ for their home and found a music teacher. Frederick became his teacher. Now, Frederick had a drinking problem and was often not ready for church because he was too drunk. So often he had George play for him at church. And soon little George had taken over most of the church work. Then in 1697, George's father died. This was very hard on young George, and he soon found himself bearing his grief in music. George went on to university and then traveled to Italy, and soon he became a master at Italian opera. In 1710, Prince George of Germany had him create music for him. When Prince George became the King of Great Britain, he asked our musician friend George to move to London with him. He gave him a salary and a grand place to live. Soon George was living the lifestyle of the rich and famous. Many of his operas became famous. His shows were known for great set designs and costumes, and his music was unmatched. And here we start the story of our second man, Thomas Crom. In 1704, an uneducated sea captain landed in London, England. He'd begun working on ships at the age of 11 and had worked his way up to sea captain. Thomas had traveled to the New World and had lived for 10 years in Massachusetts owning and operating a shipyard. Now in his late 30s, he was returning to London, but what he saw that day changed his life forever. Walking through the streets, he was appalled at the number of street children. But it was when he found a small, frozen baby that he knew things needed to change. Thomas tried to save the little baby, but it was obvious the baby was dead and had been frozen for some time. However, as horrifying as this was, Thomas was even more horrified to find out that no one seemed to care or be surprised. It seemed that finding frozen babies was not out of the ordinary. As Thomas talked to more of his friends, he learned the stories of young ladies who would move to London after being told they would find jobs and husbands here. The wealthy men of London took advantage of these poor young girls, promising them marriage. However, once the girls were pregnant, the wealthy men would simply disappear, leaving the girls homeless and pregnant. These girls were often very young and would either abandon their babies to die in the cold, or once their babies died, leave them behind because they had no way to bury them. Around 1,000 babies a year were being abandoned to die in the streets of starvation and cold. Thomas knew that God wanted him to find a way to help these mothers and these babies. So he came up with an idea. He would start a hospital just for new babies, and mothers could bring their babies and leave them at the hospital where they would be cared for until the mothers were able to return and take care of them. But this would take money, and Thomas had to find a way to pay for it. So he went to the churches. That seemed like the obvious place to go. The churches were so large and had elaborate structures here in London. They had plenty of money, and if each of the churches shared just some of their money, they could easily be able to build his hospital. However, the churches were not interested. He was told such a place would only encourage girls to continue their bad behavior, and the church could not endorse such a thing. Not even a penny was given to Thomas. Thomas then went to the men of society, since many of them were the fathers of these babies that were dying. But none of the men would even see him. Then Thomas met a young lady, the Duchess of Somerset. She was only a young teenager herself and was married to a rich lord, in fact, the richest one in all of London. And she had just had a brand new baby herself. Thomas asked her for help. The young lady was very well known and because of her husband had many connections. She agreed to help raise the money and put her name on the charity bill. Soon the money started to come in and the hospital was built. A movement was started called the Cult of Sensibility. It was the fashion of the day to show concern for the poor, especially the poor children. Meanwhile, our musician George was unmoved by this new cult of sensitivity. Even though he had lost his father at a young age, he was more concerned with problems he was facing in the theater. You see, it was 1718, and society was changing, and the Italian opera was not very popular anymore. People didn't want Italian, they wanted English. And soon George's shows stopped making money. George was used to living the high life. He was living in a borrowed castle, and he was friends with princes and lords and ladies. But he was forced to move into a more modest home, and it looked like he was done. People thought he would just retire and live a modest life with the money he had earned. However, George started writing oratory or choir music. He didn't need grand costumes or sets anymore, and he made sure that his new music was in English. It was a restart of his career. George also decided to use biblical stories. These became popular, and before you knew it, his career was on the rise again. This brings us to our third man in our stories, Charles Jennings. Charles was a landowner and extremely wealthy. His entire life, anything he needed was provided for him, and everything that needed to be done was done for him. Now, Charles was an extremely serious person. He was the kind of guy who wanted to know the rules and then wanted every rule to be followed perfectly. He grew up with much time on his hands, and he was an avid reader and collector. He especially loved to collect art and music. He traveled in high society circles and was friends with great composers, such as our main character, George. Now, Charles was a Christian, and he took his Christianity as seriously as he took everything else in his life. Now, there was a movement growing in London called the Deist movement. This was a movement that said you don't need the Bible or Jesus to know God. We can know God and learn about God through science. Charles was so upset to see this belief growing amongst high society that he decided he would write an oratory for his friend George. His idea would be to write something so magnificent that all the eyes and hearts of high society would be turned back to Jesus. He imagined the oratory would be sung in a grand chapel. Charles took his Bible and began to copy out scripture. He started with the Old Testament and found every single verse that prophesied the life of Jesus. He then went to the New Testament and copied out every single verse about Jesus, right up until the book of Revelation. This was the blueprint. He then used these words he had written out as text and got to work writing his music. When he finished his oratory, he brought it to his friend George. He told George it was an oratory of the grandest theme in all of history, the Messiah himself. But as he started to explain, the plot was in 3 parts. Telling Jesus was coming, and then the life of Jesus, and then the return of Jesus. Jesus was the main character and also the only character in the oratory. However, Jesus had no lines. It was about him, but he never spoke. George wasn't interested. It sounded like one of Charles' silly ideas. But he took the oratory and put it on a shelf. A year and a half later, George was looking for ideas for a new oratory, and he took the oratory down from a shelf, dusted it off, and read the words. He began to write music. It was as if he was possessed. His hands could barely keep up with the music. It was as if it was writing itself. In only 24 days, he had written the music to the entire oratory. Jennings didn't know George was writing the oratory finally. When he learned the music had been written in just 24 days, he was angry. It seemed his friend didn't understand the magnitude or the beauty of the text, and he had clearly not put the effort in that it was worth. Then he learned that George had taken off to Dublin to put a choir together, and he was planning on performing it in a theater. Even more devastating, George was using Suzanne Kibber as his main female soloist. Suzanne was an adulterer. The press had been covering her horrible affair in great detail for some time. She was so despised by high society that the last play she was in was empty, because no one respectable would ever be seen attending a play that Suzanne was in. Jennings wrote a letter to George telling him how angry he was. But while Jennings had all the facts correct, he didn't actually know the whole story. You see, George had been changed while writing the music of this great oratory. As he wrote one of the songs called Hallelujah Chorus, he had felt that suddenly he had been transported to heaven itself, and that he had seen the throne of God. As his hand wrote the last note, he had fallen to the ground, face down in tears. He was no longer looking for fame or fortune. And as he had finished up the music, his friend, the Duke of Devonshire, had written to him asking for help. You see, there was a problem in Ireland. There had been a famine, and people were starving. And the worst situation of all was debtors' prison. Those people with debts were forced to work hard labor, and people were starving to death in the prisons. He wanted to help the people get out of prisons, and he had an idea. If George could come and perform one of his operas or oratories in the theater, and give the money from the show to pay off the debts of some of his prisoners, that would help so much. When George read the letter, he knew he had just the right oratory. And he also had the right soloist. You see, Susanna had been forced into a marriage at a very young age, and her husband had been abusive and stolen any money she got from her acting jobs. When she tried to hide her money in the theater, he had broken into the theater and stolen it. Susanna had fallen in love with another man, and the two had run off together. Her husband had come to the home with large men, taken her by force, and locked her up. She'd been rescued later by her brother. She returned to the man she was living with and gave birth to their little girl. But her husband had actually hid a spy in their closet and watched them at night. Then her husband took her to court and had his spy give detailed description of what he saw that night. And every horrible detail was printed in the papers. She was not seen as a woman escaping a forced, abusive marriage. She was portrayed as a prostitute. She was despised. And George knew that she needed the message of this new oratory more than any other woman in London. So he had her come with him to Dublin to perform. Now, she didn't read music, so George sat with her and taught her the entire oratory, line by line, until it was perfect. Next, George needed a choir. Now, the St. Patrick's Choir was the greatest choir in Ireland, but the head of the church, Jonathan Swift, was against it. He didn't think the music should be played outside of a church, and he was very opposed to Susanna being part of the performance. However, he was kind of pressured into it by a man named Patrick Denley, who was taking over the church. The theater was packed, and Susanna rose to sing. The theater was in awe, and Patrick Denley stood and called out, "Woman, for this be all thy sins forgiven." Instead of doing just one performance, George stayed for months and continued to perform. He paid his musicians and singers, but he did not even take a penny for himself. Before he left, he had paid the debt of 150 prisoners, all freed and able to return home. And once he left, the choir continued to perform and pay for even more prisoners. By the time George returned to London, Jennings was no longer angry. He could see that while his plan of a great oratory sung in a grand chapel for the most elite was a great and grand plan, God's plan was so much better. In London, the oratory was played for the elite in the chapels as Jennings had imagined. It was met half-heartedly. People enjoyed the music, but there was not the heart change that had happened in Dublin. Now, there is a story of King George II attending the oratory, and as soon as the song Hallelujah Chorus started, the king stood in respect of the King of Kings. Now, the law was that if the king stood, everyone in the room had to stand as well, and so the tradition of standing for this song started. But it is unsure if this really happened, or if it's just part of the mystique of this song. Meanwhile, Thomas was still working on his hospital, and in March 25th, 1741, the doors opened, and immediately every bed was filled. The mothers had to be turned away because there was just not enough room for all the babies. Unfortunately, many of the babies died in the hospital. They were already too sick to help. But with every bed that opened, hundreds of mothers were still waiting. The hospital was in desperate need for help. An artist in the area had started using the hall of the hospital as an art gallery, with places for people to donate money for the hospital, making it the first open to the public art gallery in the world. George decided he was going to hold a fundraiser in the hospital, and he had his grand oratory performed at the hospital. So many tickets were sold that women were told they could not wear hoop skirts because there would just not be enough room for all the people if they wore hoop skirts. It was so well received, and the hospital raised enough money to keep its doors opened. George made the hospital the place the oratory would be performed. He never ever took even a single penny for the music, and all of the money went to the poor, the debtors, prisoners, or orphans. George eventually went blind and had to stop conducting the music, but he continued to come and listen. The last performance he sat through was just 8 days before he died. While George wrote many operas and oratories, it was just this one that would become world famous. George Frideric Handel died April 14th, 1759. While the oratory is called Messiah, it is known by most people as Handel's Messiah. However, George Handel did not write his name on the music as most musicians do. He wrote instead, under the author, "To the Glory of God." Today, it is the most recognizable song in the world. It is sung worldwide, and it still touches hearts. Now, as Canadians, I need to add a little extra history about the orphans in London. More hospitals and orphanages were opened in London, and all of them were full and overcrowded. We're going to be talking about that later in our church history. But in 1872, a missionary named Dr. Thomas John Bernardo worked with the people of Canada to help solve the orphan problem in London. He asked the people of Canada to adopt the children of London. Full shiploads of children were brought to Canada, where families waited at the shipyards to meet their new children. The first shipment of children was in 1862, and the last shipment was in 1930. In total, Canadian families adopted over 100,000 children from the streets of London. And today in Canada, about 1 out of every 10 Canadians are offsprings of one of these children. September 28th is marked on our calendar as a day to honor these children. I hope you enjoyed this story of Handel's Messiah. It is probably my favorite choir music. I previously published the book, The Church is Born, which was part 1 in our series, and that delved into the creation of the church. But my second book picks up where the first one left off. It offers a unique and insightful perspective on the church's journey. Discover the rich history of the church, its triumphs, its failures, and its heroes. In this second book in the series on church history, we journey through the pivotal moments that shaped Christianity as we know it. From the foundational theology of the early church to the inspiring lives of great men and women who boldly stood for their faith. Explore the church's role during the Crusades, the Inquisitions, and even the discovery of America. Learn how over centuries the church began to slowly lose its way, setting the stage for the monumental changes just before the Protestant Reformation. With each chapter highlighting a different story, you're going to be inspired by the heroes of our faith and challenged to reflect on the lessons from the church's successes and its stumbles. Whether you're a seasoned historian or just beginning your exploration of church history, this book offers valuable insights for everyone. Both books, The Church is Born and The Church is Compromised, are available on Amazon for you to order. So if you haven't gotten the first book, why not get both today and delve into the comprehensive understanding of the church's journey? A young girl woke from her sleep to the smell of smoke. It was year 1707 in a small town in England. In this church parish, a family with 8 children were sound asleep. The mother was 9 months pregnant and sick. So when the young girl woke to the smell of smoke and jumped from her bed to wake her siblings, it soon turned to panic. The family all ran from the house, and the father and the older children had to help their mother from her bed and out the door. Once outside, the father started counting his children and realized he was 1 short. Their youngest child, John, was still inside. He was sleeping in the attic. The father rushed back into the house and up the stairs. The smoke surrounded him, and he could feel the heat of the fire. Halfway up the stairs, the wood beneath him gave way and he fell to the bottom floor. He was able to pull himself up and back out the front door. There was no way to reach his child, still trapped in the attic. The family huddled in a circle outside, praying and giving the soul of their young son to God. Neighbors started arriving, having been awoken by the brightness of the flames that was now engulfing the house. John was asleep in the attic. He woke up. John rolled out of bed and crawled to a chest and then climbed on the chest of the window. He opened the window and looked out at his yard. The neighbors were all there and his family. The crowd, seeing little John, went into a panic. They could not just sit by and watch this little boy burn to death. One man climbed onto the shoulders of another man. He still was not tall enough. Another man then climbed onto his shoulders, and soon the men had created a human ladder. They could feel the heat of the fire, and if the man on the ground was to trip and fall, they would all be burned. They moved closer and closer to the fire until the man at the top was able to reach little John. That night, the whole family was saved, and shortly later the mother gave birth to another little boy, Charles. Charles and John would become very close growing up, and the two would change England, and God would use them to bring a great revival. The Wesley family that night lost everything, except each other. 20 years later, the brothers were studying at Oxford University. The boys had a group of friends that would meet regularly for Bible study and to do good deeds. 2 of their friends were William Wilberforce and George Whitefield. The group was obsessed with finding a way to reconcile with God. They kept notebooks with them and wrote down every sin they committed so they could confess to the group and to God. They visited prisons and they fed the poor. They fasted twice a week. They had very rigorous and detailed methods of prayer and Bible study. If you wanted to be friends with this group, you had to follow all of their methods that they laid out. The other boys in the school started calling them the Holy Club. Then another name was started, the Methodists. The group loved the term Holy Club, and they also embraced the Methodists. After leaving Oxford, the brothers began preaching. They preached their new Methodist, rigorous way of keeping oneself holy. They also spent a lot of time in the prisons preaching. The prisons were so full that a large group of prisoners were put on a boat and shipped to the Americas. They would live in a colony called Georgia. The boys were asked to go to Georgia and pastor a church for the now much larger congregation. The brothers agreed. On the way to Georgia, the boat was hit with a storm. and it seemed they would soon die and drown. Both Charles and John were in a panic, sure that they would die. Yet another group on the boat didn't seem to panic at all. They stated so clearly that they would see Jesus and be with him if they died that they had no fear of death. Even the small children from this group were singing with no fear of death. Charles and John could not understand how these people could be so sure of their eternal destination. The storm ended and they all survived, and in 1735 they landed in Georgia. They preached their method of holiness and demanded those in the church follow their methods. The congregation did not like that. They were not happy with them at all, and after a short period of time, the brothers were forced to return to London. The brothers were discouraged, hurt, embarrassed, and questioning God. They met a man named Peter who talked to them about God's grace and God's love. The brothers had many long conversations with Peter. Could it be that these pious young preachers had never actually understood the gospel? On May 21st in 1738, Charles finally fully understood the gospel and called out to Jesus Christ, asking for forgiveness for his sins and trusting in Jesus' work on the cross alone to save him. He felt immediately the peace and assurance he had seen on the faces of those who had almost been shipwrecked on the journey to the Americas. Just 3 days later, John was heading into church for a weekday service. The preacher was reading the introduction to Romans, written by Martin Luther. Suddenly, John felt his heart race. He remembered waking up in the fire and having no way to save himself. This picture burned into his heart. He was awakened to who he was, all of his piety and good deeds, all his methods of holiness. They were all nothing. There was no way he could save himself. Then suddenly he remembered the verse, "This is how we know God. Not that we loved God, but that God loved us and sent his Son to be the Savior of the world." It was not his love for God that had the power to save him. It was God's love that had the power to save him. That day, John became a Christian, and the two brothers began to preach with a new vigor. Now empowered by the Holy Spirit, they were on a mission. At that time in history, only the wealthy could attend church. You would purchase a pew, and that was your family pew. Those who did not have the money could not attend church. So the brothers started to go out in the fields and hold services in the fields. People would come from all around and hear the good news of Jesus Christ. And so many people became Christians that at this time in history is now known as the Great Awakening. There were other friends from the Holy Club that also joined them. One man, William Wilberforce, made it his life goal to end debtor's prison and abolish slavery. 1 year after becoming a Christian, Charles was walking outside on Christmas Day. As he walked, he felt the snow crunch beneath his feet, and the London church bells started to ring. He thought, the bells are singing, "Hark, come and worship." He was inspired by all that had happened that year. There was a joy he had never felt before, and this Christmas was so different than any other Christmas he'd ever had before. When he got home, he wrote these words, "Hark, the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King, peace on earth and mercy mild, God and sinners reconciled. Joyful, all ye nations rise, join the triumph of the skies, and with angelic host proclaim, Christ is born in Bethlehem. Hark, the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King." A year later, his friend from the Holy Club, George Whitefield, added music, and this became one of the most loved Christmas songs of our time. The brothers continued to preach. However, John became the great preacher and Charles the great songwriter. John's goal was to take deep theology and put it into music that the masses could sing. The church services that they held in fields all over England would have Charles' music and John's preaching. In 1751, slavery was finally abolished in England, and the Great Awakening was a very large part of that. By the time Charles died in 1788, He had written over 6,000 hymns. Our song today is one of the many great songs Charles wrote. Remember, the reason he wrote the songs was to teach doctrine to the masses. So as you listen to the song, please hear all the great theology that is part of this wonderful song. Today we're hearing this song with permission from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. I cannot recommend their YouTube channel highly enough. Not only are the music videos fantastic, but there's phenomenal preaching on the channel as well. This is also the home of Albert Molnar. His podcast, The Briefing, is one of my never-miss podcasts. In fact, both my husband and I listen to that podcast every day, and I recommend both the podcast and the YouTube channel, and I will have links to all of that in the show notes. But right now, let's hear the words, "Hark, the Herald Angels Sing."
My highest heaven adored, Christ the everlasting